The clock strikes midnight. The world outside is silent, but in the shadows, something stirs. The air grows thick, heavy with the scent of dread, and the whispers of the unseen slither through the dark. Tonight, dear listeners, the veil between the ordinary and the unknown is thin, and what lies beyond is waiting, waiting to be seen, waiting to be heard, waiting for you. Prepare yourself for a night of terror, a night where the things you fear most come to life. The candle flickers, the wind howls, and in the darkness, something watches. This is Dr. Sinister Tales of Terror. And tonight, you won't be sleeping if you would be so kind as to hit the like button and subscribe for more. Let us begin. The wind carried the scent of damp earth and pine needles through the trees as Jade and Mallory sat cross-legged in the treehouse, a dim lantern casting flickering light against the wooden walls. The small hideaway, built years ago by Jade's dad, was their escape, a rickety fort high above the world, tucked away in the dense woods behind her house. They'd been up there for nearly an hour, sharing a joint and sipping cheap vodka from a flask, their laughter mingling with the night sounds. "This place is kinda creepy at night," Mallory muttered, exhaling a thin stream of smoke. "Like, if someone was watching us right now, we'd have nowhere to go." Jade smirked, passing her the flask. "That's why I always pull the ladder up. Nobody's climbing up here unless I let 'em." Mallory took a swig, shivering as the liquor burned its way down. She leaned back against the wooden wall, staring out of the window. Something moved below. At first she thought it was a trick of the moonlight, just shifting shadows between the trees. But then she saw it. A woman stood at the base of the tree. She was old, her skin waxy and stretched too tight over her skull. Long, stringy white hair hung from her scalp, and her arms dangled at her sides like empty sleeves of flesh. She wore a ragged black dress, torn and frayed at the edges, the hem brushing against the dirt. And she was staring. Jade?" Mallory whispered, her voice unsteady. Jade frowned, still giggling at something. "What?" Mallory didn't answer. She just pointed. Jade followed her gaze and froze. The woman's head was tilted at an unnatural angle, her face almost serene, smiling as she looked up at them. The lantern's glow barely reached her, but her eyes, they caught the light, milky and clouded, unblinking. "Who the fuck is that?" Jade whispered. "I don't know." Mallory breathed. The woman didn't move. She just stood there, staring. Jade's pulse kicked up. Her hands felt numb, the haze of weed and alcohol doing nothing to soften the creeping terror unfurling inside her. Slowly, she reached for the rope ladder that dangled from the entrance. The second her fingers touched it, the old woman's mouth twitched. Jade yanked the ladder up. The rungs scraped against the wooden slats as she pulled it into the treehouse, her breath shallow. Now there was no way up, no way for her to climb. "Holy shit," Mallory whispered, pressing herself against the wall. The woman still didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there grinning up at them, her lips dry and cracked like old parchment. Then, a sound, a low, wet pop and crack. The woman's neck began to lengthen. Mallory sucked in a sharp breath, clutching Jade's arm. The woman's bones groaned beneath her skin as her head rose, inch by inch, upward. Her vertebrae popped, her skin stretched, straining, splitting in places like old rubber. Still her smile never faded. Still, her eyes never left them. Higher, higher. Her head inched toward the treehouse window. The wooden walls of the fort suddenly felt too thin. Jade could hear her own heartbeat, the blood roaring in her ears. This wasn't real, couldn't be real, But the old woman's neck kept growing. Her chin lifted past the first set of planks, then her mouth, then her nose, her eyes, and then she was there, level with the window, staring inside. Mallory whimpered, gripping Jade's wrist so hard her nails dug into flesh. The woman's face was unnatural up close. The skin around her lips was cracked and peeled away, revealing wet pink gums beneath. Her jaw twitched, opening slightly, just enough to show rows of yellowed teeth. Her breath hit the glass, fogging it, and then, in a voice that sounded like rotting wood snapping underfoot, she spoke. "Let me in." The words slithered into the room, sinking into their skin like damp mold. Neither of them moved. Neither of them breathed. The old woman blinked. Once, slow and deliberate. Then her mouth stretched wider. Her neck twisted, bones shifting, realigning, as though she were preparing to crawl through the window. Jade grabbed Mallory's arm and yanked her toward the opposite side of the treehouse. "We have to get down," she whispered. "There's no ladder." Mallory hissed back, her breath ragged. The old woman tilted her head, her long, spindly neck creaking like an old chair. She was listening and smiling. Jade's stomach twisted. They had to move. "Now the other side," she murmured. "We can jump. We just need to—" A hard thump against the glass. They both froze. The old woman was repeatedly hitting her head against the window, and then a long, jagged nail dragged down the glass, leaving a thin, white scratch. Jade's breath hitched. Mallory choked back a sob. Then the door creaked. The latch was turning. Jade didn't wait. She grabbed Mallory and threw open the opposite window. Cold air rushed in. The ground below looked farther than she'd realized. But there was no choice. "Go!" she screamed. Mallory didn't hesitate. She lunged forward, throwing herself into the open air. Jade followed a second later, the wind rushing past her, the world tilting. She hit the earth hard, the impact rattling through her bones. A sharp pain shot up her ankle, but she barely registered it. Mallory scrambled to her feet, gasping, eyes wild. Jade turned, looking up. The old woman's face was pressed against the window now, the glass bending outward, her neck still growing, stretching into the dark like a grotesque vine. Jade didn't wait to see what happened next. She grabbed Mallory's wrist and ran. They tore through the woods, breath ragged, twigs snapping beneath their feet. Neither of them looked back. Neither of them dared. And as they reached the back porch, as they stumbled inside and slammed the door shut behind them, they heard it. The sound of something slithering, something retreating, something dragging itself back into the woods. The next morning, when Jade found the courage to go outside, she found a single long white hair curled at the base of the tree, and deep in the dirt, at the foot of the ladder, were two impossibly large footprints, facing the house, waiting. The house had been quiet for hours. Erica sat curled up on the couch, sipping cold tea, eyes half-lidded as she watched the baby monitor's small screen. The grainy black and white image of Lily's crib flickered in and out of clarity. Lily was asleep, tiny fists curled near her face, her little chest rising and falling in a slow, rhythmic motion. Erica exhaled, relieved. Moving into this old house had been stressful. A new place, a new baby, and a husband who worked late shifts, leaving her alone most nights. Too many nights. The wind outside howled against the windows, and the floorboards creaked now and then. Normal sounds, but at night, when the house was empty except for her and Lily, every little noise felt off. She glanced back at the baby monitor again and froze. There was a movement in the far corner of the nursery. At first, she thought it was just a glitch. The old house had shitty wiring, and the monitor sometimes flickered, but this wasn't static. This was something shifting, a shadow, tall, thin, lurking just beyond the crib. Erica sat up straighter, her pulse kicking up a notch. The figure didn't move. It just stood there. A trick of the light, she told herself. The longer she stared, the more it seemed to fade, like an after-image in her brain. Still, a sick feeling curled in her stomach. She set the monitor down, stood up, and headed for the stairs. The house groaned as she walked, the wood beneath her feet giving slightly, like something shifting in its sleep. When she reached the nursery door, she hesitated. The silence pressed against her ears. One hand on the doorknob, she slowly pushed it open. The room was empty. Nothing in the corner, nothing but the faint scent of baby powder and warm blankets. Lily lay in her crib, breathing softly, oblivious to her mother's thundering heart. Erica let out a slow breath. Maybe she was just tired. Maybe she was just seeing things. She adjusted the blanket over Lily's tiny body, brushing a strand of fine hair from her forehead. Then, leaving the nursery door slightly ajar, she made her way back downstairs. She sank onto the couch, laughing at herself. "This house is getting to me," she muttered, picking up the monitor again. Lily was still there, still sleeping, still safe. Erica leaned back, rubbing her tired eyes, and then the shadow moved again. Her body locked up. It was back, but closer now, just at the edge of the crib. The static from the monitor hissed, breaking the silence like dry leaves rustling in the wind. The shadow tilted its head, and then the screen went black. Erica sucked in a sharp breath. She smacked the monitor's side, the way you do with old electronics, willing the picture to return. When it did, the shadow was gone. Lily was fine. The crib was empty. Her stomach churned. She had seen it. She knew she had seen it. This wasn't her mind playing tricks on her. For the next few nights, the same thing happened. Every time she looked at the monitor, the shadow was there. At first, it stayed in the corner, blending into the dark, barely distinguishable from the furniture. But then each night, it got closer. One night, it was at the crib's edge. The next night, it was leaning over the railing. A few nights later, it was peering into the crib, just inches from Lily's face. And each time, Erica ran upstairs, only to find nothing. Nothing but the warm scent of her baby and the emptiness of the nursery. She stopped sleeping, stopped eating properly. Every muscle in her body tensed each time she checked the monitor. Her husband thought she was overreacting. "You're just stressed," he said over the phone one night. "You're barely sleeping. It's just your brain messing with you." She wanted to believe that. But then, the worst night came. A clicking noise woke her from a restless half-sleep on the couch. She blinked, groggily. The baby monitor was still on, sitting next to her. The screen flickered with static, the sound muffled and strange. She sat up, squinting at the screen. The crib was empty. Her body went ice cold. Her fingers tightened around the monitor as her breath hitched. Where was Lily? A soft whisper crackled through the speaker, faint, garbled. She turned the volume up. The whisper sharpened, and then clear as day, a voice whispered, "She's not yours anymore." The static exploded into a loud, ear-splitting hiss. Erica dropped the monitor, scrambling to her feet, her heartbeat pounding in her skull. She ran, flew, up the stairs, nearly slamming into the nursery door. The room was cold, too cold. The crib was empty. The blankets were still warm, and in the corner, where the shadow had always been, the closet door hung open. Inside, the darkness was too deep, too wrong. A sound rose from it, a slow, creaking breath, And then, a long, skeletal hand reached out. Fingers too thin, too long, curled around the edge of the door. Then a second hand. Then a face. Not a person's face. Not human at all. It smiled, stretching far too wide, black gums parting over a mouth filled with rows of tiny, needle-like teeth. The whisper returned, but this time, it came from inside the room. She belongs to us now. Erica did the only thing she could. She screamed, and the last thing she saw before the world shattered around her was Lily's tiny foot being dragged into the dark. It was a cold, silent night when Naya left her friend's apartment, pulling her coat tight around her body as she started the walk home. She had debated staying the night, but she had work in the morning and didn't want to wake up in someone else's place, groggy and uncomfortable. Besides, it wasn't that far. A 30-minute walk through the quiet suburban streets. No big deal. The night was crisp, the moon full, casting long silver shadows across the empty sidewalks. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of eerie silence that made Naya's footsteps sound too loud. She turned onto Linden Avenue, a long, lonely stretch of road lined with old, leafless trees. The streetlights were spaced too far apart, leaving long patches of darkness between them. As she walked, she pulled out her phone, scrolling through music, deciding whether she wanted something upbeat to cut through the silence. But just as she slipped in one earbud, she heard it. A second set of footsteps. Behind her, she stopped. The footsteps stopped. Her pulse jumped. Slowly, she turned her head, glancing over her shoulder. The street was empty. Nothing but dark houses and the pale glow of the streetlights. She let out a shaky laugh, shaking her head. Maybe it was the way sound carried in the cold air. She kept walking. Then, the footsteps started again, closer. Her stomach tightened. This time, she didn't stop. She kept walking, faster. Her breath curled in the air as her legs carried her forward, past parked cars, past empty driveways, past houses where the windows were dark, where no one would see her if... No, don't think like that. She just had to get to Washington Street. That was a main road, busier, safer. She risked another glance back, and that's when she saw it. A tall figure, standing beneath one of the streetlights, just beyond the last patch of darkness. It didn't move. It just stood there, watching. A man? Number something was wrong with it. It was too tall, its limbs too long, too thin, and its face. She couldn't see a face at all, just a dark shape where its features should have been. A tremor ran through her body. She turned away, walking faster. Don't run. Running would make it worse. She wasn't sure how she knew that, but she did. Her heart thundered in her chest as she reached another patch of darkness between streetlights. She stepped into the shadow, and the footsteps behind her broke into a run. Naya's body reacted before her mind did. She bolted. Her feet slammed against the pavement, her breath sharp and fast as she raced toward the next pool of light. The sound behind her, that awful, frantic pounding of footsteps, grew closer, closer. She didn't dare look back. Instead, she ran harder, her lungs burning as she reached the next streetlight, crossing into the pale glow. The footsteps stopped. She whirled around. The street behind her was empty. No sign of the tall thing, no sound, just the night. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her body trembling with adrenaline. She wasn't crazy. She knew she had heard it. She had felt it behind her, but it was gone. And then from the darkness ahead, a whisper, low, raspy, right next to her ear. Keep walking. Naya's body locked up. The voice hadn't come from behind her. It had come from beside her. She turned her head slowly, dread pooling in her stomach. And there it was, standing in the shadow of a tree, close enough to touch, close enough that she could see the horrible shape of it. Its arms too long, its fingers stretched and claw-like, its face just a void, a space where something human should have been. Naya couldn't scream, couldn't breathe. It didn't move, didn't need to, because now she could feel it. That overwhelming, suffocating presence, like a shadow curling around her ribs, like something hollow and starving. Slowly, it lifted one hand, pointed down the road. The voice came again, closer now, inside her head. Keep walking. Naya ran. She didn't stop, didn't look back, didn't slow down until she reached Washington Street, where the neon glow of a gas station lit the road in warm, comforting light. She stood there, panting, shaking, barely able to keep herself upright. Behind her, the long stretch of Linden Avenue was empty. The thing was gone. Or maybe it was still watching, still waiting, and next time, she might not be fast enough. Margaret sat at her desk, the dull hum of office lights overhead casting an artificial glow on her skin. It was late. Too late. She'd worked past her shift, finishing reports for a boss who didn't care, in a building that felt lifeless after dark. Her phone vibrated against the desk, breaking the silence. She picked it up, expecting an email or perhaps a last-minute message from a coworker. Instead, the words made her blood run cold. I see you. She blinked, her breath catching in her throat. The number was unknown. Probably a prank. Probably nothing. A slow exhale. She locked her phone and stuffed it into her bag. She wasn't in the mood for games. Grabbing her coat, she headed to the elevators. A flickering red light on the control panel signaled out of order. Great, she muttered. That meant 10 flights of stairs, alone, at night. She pushed open the heavy stairwell door. The air inside was different, cooler, tinged with something stale, like the scent of concrete damp with age. The door swung shut behind her with a dull echo. She started descending. Her heels clicked against the steps, the sound bouncing off the walls. Click, click, click. A few flights down, she hesitated. What was that sound? Footsteps. Faint. Above her. She looked up, her eyes straining against the dim emergency lights. Nothing. Just empty stairs. A trick of the echoes. She kept walking, her pulse quickening. Click, 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 shuffle. She stopped dead. That wasn't an echo. That was someone moving. Slowly she turned her head upward. 2 flights above her stood a man. He was tall, his frame elongated by the poor lighting. His face, half hidden beneath the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat, was stretched into a smile. A grin so wide, it looked unnatural. Margaret's chest tightened. The man didn't move. He only watched, smiling. She swallowed hard and picked up her pace. Her heels tapped faster against the steps, her breath shallow. The footsteps above her followed, slow, measured. She reached the bottom floor and shoved the door open, spilling into the parking garage. The cold air hit her like a slap, but she didn't stop moving. Her car was only a few rows away. Behind her, the stairwell door creaked open. Margaret didn't look back. She unlocked her car with trembling hands and threw herself inside, locking the doors. For a moment, she just breathed. The world outside was silent, unmoving, just her paranoia. She started the engine. The headlights flared to life, illuminating the path ahead. And there he was, standing in the shadows near the exit, still smiling, her breath caught in her throat. The hat cast his face into near darkness. but she could feel his eyes, watching, knowing. She slammed the gas. The tires screeched as she sped out of the garage and into the night. Olivia slammed the apartment door shut behind her, twisting the deadbolt with shaking fingers. Her chest heaved, her heartbeat hammering against her ribs. The silence of her apartment pressed in, thick and unbroken. She stood there for a long moment, listening. The only sound was the distant hum of the refrigerator. No footsteps, no slow, measured breathing, no man in the wide brim hat. She let out a long, trembling breath. Her apartment was small but comfortable. A modern one-bedroom with warm lighting, minimalist decor, and a balcony overlooking the quiet street below. She tossed her purse onto the counter, peeled off her coat, and ran her fingers through her hair. Her nerves still hummed, her body still tense, but she told herself she was safe. The man was probably some random creep in the garage. Nothing more. She moved to the kitchen, filling a glass with water. Her hands were still shaking. She turned on the TV, needing the sound, the light, anything to push away the weight of what had just happened. The screen flickered to life, filling the apartment with a soft blue glow. Some late-night infomercial droned on about non-stick pans. Normal, boring. She exhaled, sinking onto the couch. Her phone buzzed on the table. She flinched. Slowly, she reached for it. A text. "You forgot to say goodnight." The glass slipped from her fingers, water spilling across the table. Her stomach twisted. No number, just the message. She stared at the screen, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Her thumb hovered over the keyboard. She wanted to type something. "Who is this?" or "Leave me alone." But her fingers wouldn't move. A long, slow creak whispered through the apartment. Her head snapped up. The balcony door. It was open, just an inch. A black sliver of night bleeding into the room. Her hands were ice cold. She had locked that door. She knew she had. The curtains fluttered as a draft curled through the room. The city beyond was silent, the streetlights casting long, skeletal shadows across the pavement. With slow, careful movements, she rose from the couch and approached the door. Her pulse pounded in her ears. The glass door reflected her face, pale, wide-eyed, and behind her, a shadow. She spun around, her heart lurching into her throat. Nothing. The room was empty. She reached out and slammed the balcony door shut, locking it. The reflection in the glass showed nothing but her own ghostly silhouette. She backed away, rubbing her arms. The temperature had dropped, the apartment feeling colder than before. She glanced at the hallway leading to her bedroom. The open doorway yawned like a dark mouth. Her bed. She just needed to get to her bed. Get under the covers, bury herself in warmth, and sleep this night away. She hurried into her room, shutting the door behind her. She didn't bother turning on the lights. The glow from the street lamps outside spilled in through the curtains, painting pale shapes on the walls. Her bed welcomed her, the blankets a cocoon against the world. She closed her eyes. Minutes passed, then an hour. She wasn't sure when her breathing slowed, when exhaustion finally dragged her down, and then a sound. Breathing, not hers. Slow, deep, too close. Her eyes fluttered open. The room was dark, but not empty. A shape stood in the corner, motionless, watching. A tall silhouette with a wide brim hat, its edges blurred by the darkness. She couldn't move. Her body had turned to lead. Her breath caught somewhere between her lungs and her throat. Her mind screamed at her to run, to scream, to do something, but she couldn't. The figure stepped forward. The floor creaked beneath its weight. Another step. The air grew thick. suffocating. Olivia wanted to shut her eyes, to will this away, but she was frozen. The man tilted his head, his mouth curled into that same grin, and then he spoke, a voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind, soft and rasping. "I see you." The room plunged into darkness, and the last thing Olivia felt, before the world swallowed her whole, was the icy whisper of breath against her cheek.